Afternoon, everyone. We are live, so it's my great pleasure to introduce another stellar speaker this afternoon, Professor Dr. Laura Pereira from the Global Change Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa, and the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden. Laura's CV is also very long, so I will cut this down to some key facts about her professional life and career. Laura's work focuses on sustainability transformations in developing countries and futures thinking, especially related to the IPBES Nature Futures Framework. Laura is currently an Earth Commissioner and a lead author on the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment and then UNEP's GEO7 assessment. She was previously a member of the IPBES Task Force on Scenarios and Models, a lead author for the IPBES Regional Assessment for Africa, and a review editor for the IPBES Values Assessment. She has also been a coordinating lead author for UN Environment's GEO6 assessment and a lead author for the GEO6 Africa Regional Assessment. Laura sits on the Scientific Advisory Board of Europe's FACCE Joint Programming Initiative and South Africa's National Research Foundation's Global Change Committee. She's a member of the Program on Ecosystem Change and Society and a core member of the Mountain Research Initiative Social Ecological Futures Working Group. Laura sits on many more advisory boards of many more projects. I will only mention the EU-funded BioNext project. So I'm very excited to have Laura here as a speaker for the FCB workshop. Laura, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Christian. And I hope having the microphone here will pick up my sound sufficiently. It's an impossible act to follow Rashid after Vanishing and Infinity Fish, but it should be on. Yeah, think it's working. Should be no.
So you want to take it
even if it's here.
you can put it down, right? So you'll be like Costa. Sorry.
We tested it earlier. I asked the guy, and he was like, "No, it's fine. You can leave it there." It's already off to a great start. So following Rashid, but taking a completely different take on the social sciences, I think. But also building on what you were mentioning around what we actually need to let go of, and also emphasizing these multiple aspects of justice when we're thinking about what actually constitutes a preferable future. Or preferable futures for people and the planet. So that's largely what I'm going to be focusing on during this talk, and giving a variety of examples of case studies where we've started to do more participatory research around scenario planning, around visioning, etc. But I want to start, and this is becoming an old trick for some of you, but for the rest of you who haven't gone through this before, I'd invite you all to just close your eyes and imagine a future where we got everything right, where we met the Paris Agreement, we met the Global Biodiversity Framework targets, we achieved the SDGs. What does that world look like to you? Getting things right. So I find that really, really hard to do. You can open it. I don't know about you. Because we're surrounded by these narratives of fires and floods and heat waves and hurricanes, and just the reality of the environmental changes, the inequalities that we're surrounded with. And we're also surrounded by a lot of narratives and stories and discourses about collapse, right? So it's a lot easier for us to understand how the sixth extinction, we could land up in a Mad Max world where everything collapses, right? Water wars, the day after tomorrow. Extrapolations, if anyone hasn't watched that on Apple TV, is terrifyingly accurate, I think, from a extrapolation perspective. And And so when we think about where it is we actually want to go, what is desirable, what does it mean to actually achieve these goals, I think it's quite intangible, actually. You know, we have what we call a imagination deficit, and this is going in and out, but hopefully you can still hear me. An imagination deficit in terms of what preferable futures could actually look like. And that's also because we're sitting in this novel epoch that hasn't formally been recognized, but I think we can still refer to the Anthropocene. And it's novel, it's unprecedented, we haven't been here before. It's turbulent, it's accelerating. I think most of you are familiar with the great acceleration and blue acceleration graphs, right? Of just exponential increase in human impacts on the environment. Hyperconnected, if COVID taught us one thing, it's about the hyperconnectivity of everything across the planet. But it's also highly unequal. So we're not just talking the biophysical state of the environment. We're also looking at social inequalities. And these have been conversations that we've brought up quite a bit during the past day and a half of discussions within FCB, is that called social ecological concerns that we're dealing with. But it's also not just this notion of the Anthropocene. There are many other scenes or epochs that have been described. Donna Haraway's Cluthlocene, which is about sort of making kin living with sort of messy relationalities that don't divide humans and our natures. The Capitalocene, right, sort of the rise of capital as actually as a driving force of a lot of the impacts that we're seeing. I've heard there's the Manocene, right, which is the feminist unpacking of sort of the epoch that we find ourselves. So many different ways of actually framing the period within which we find ourselves, which is causing us to have to reflect on what does it mean to get out of this? What does transformative change actually look like when we're experiencing all of these different drivers? And then this brings me to speculative fiction, and I'll keep on coming back to speculative fiction later on. And this is a quote by William Gibson, who's a science fiction writer. And he talks about the future being already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I think that that's both in terms of potential positives, but also in terms of the negatives that we're going to be seeing. And I think quite often when we go into different communities or we think about, the impacts of climate change that are coming, this is the lived experience in reality for many people around the world already that are actually facing these new realities on a day-to-day basis, right? That potential future is already there for them. But also potential solutions, right, could also be there. They're also around. They just may not be as pervasive as the dominant system. And so taking all of these things into account, what do aspirational futures for people and nature actually look like? You know, when we close our eyes, can we actually imagine what our transport system looks like, what our food system looks like, what nature in its ephemeral, almost untranslatable notion, what does that actually look like? If we get things right, if we actually do all the things that we've globally agreed to do. And so this brings me back to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the 2050 vision on biodiversity, which is about living in harmony with nature. And the work that we actually did as the EPES task force on scenarios and models, and both William and Rob are here, who were with me as part of that journey. Gary Peterson, who's also a partner on the project, was also part of that task force. And you know, we were tasked with this idea of, from a scientific perspective, what does living in harmony in nature by 2050 actually look like, right? What does this tangibly mean, taking into account the messiness of that? This is a global target, but it's going to manifest very differently in different places around the world and in different contexts, right? So how does that heterogeneity actually translate into this global vision? So we go back to 2016, where there was, together with the pollinator assessment, another very important assessment report that IPBES delivered, which is the methodological assessment on scenarios and models for global biodiversity. And the main findings from that report were that we've got scenarios, they're available, they're really important tools for policy support, But most of the ones at the global level are developed for other purposes, largely climate, right? We're sort of forced very much into a climate scenario modeling future when we think about biodiversity. At least we were in 2016, and I'd argue we probably still are to a certain extent. That very few scenarios actually detail positive or desirable or aspirational futures. They're just looking at different drivers of change, right? Like if we took this to the extreme, we had a sort of regional rivalry kind of world, what would that look like? Or if we had field development, what would that actually look like? But, you know, SSP1, which I come into the next slide on sustainability, is only one form of aspirational scenario, and it doesn't actually take a lot of biodiversity into account. They definitely lack a participatory approach, which is understandable. At the global level, to do something participatory is virtually impossible, right? So you can understand why they're largely expert-driven. But there's also a lack of just engaging with diverse knowledge systems, with different ways of seeing, with the heterogeneity that you're forced to embrace when you're thinking about biodiversity, not just climate as sort of this global effect. And that there were very few scenarios or ways of thinking about the future that actually looked at interventions, different policy and management responses, and how that could change different outcomes for different things that we value. And so, as I mentioned, sort of we were largely forced into the shared socioeconomic pathways set of narratives about how the future could play out, which was developed, as it was supposed to be, around climate, which is looking at challenges to mitigation on one axis and challenges to adaptation on the other axis, and sort of what kinds of worlds might emerge from this, and then how would we model them according to climate forcings. And so you saw SSP1, which is both of these challenges are minimized, which is the sustainability pathway, but still actually lands up being bad for nature in most of the model runs, right? So even though you have sustainability, it still isn't, from a nature perspective, actually an aspirational future. So what else could we do? And so we went through a series of very iterative processes. From the report, we went through a workshop where we did a sort of participatory process that led into a series of diverse potential futures for nature. Rashid was actually there with us. I think it was the first time I met him in person. It's a crazy thought. It was feels like it was yesterday, but it was actually many years ago. And that eventually led to the development of the Nature Futures Framework, which is the overarching tool framework that I'm going to be talking about in the rest of the talk, but is also sort of permeating a lot of the Solving-FCB project, right, as a way of trying to organize this messy complexity of heterogeneity in place, in context, in people's value systems. And as part of the process that we had to go through to actually get this welcomed by the plenary of IPES, which is not an easy task because it wasn't an assessment, it was just something that a task force did. We had a variety of government engagements, stakeholder engagements, and also engagements with the Indigenous and Local Knowledge Task Force. That also sits within IPES. And we were talking about futures and time and how we represent some of these ideas, and this was captured really beautifully, I think, in these three artwork pieces from the African region, Asian region, Americas. And you'll see that art also, so I was mentioning speculative fiction, but art has also become a more pervasive theme in terms of being able to describe and conceptualize what some of these futures actually look like. So, the Nature Futures Framework, and I have to officially say this particularly because it's being recorded, is a flexible tool to support the development of scenarios and models of desirable futures for people, nature, and Mother Earth. So we ticked off the IPES protocol there. Because we went through what was supposed to be a one-day negotiation that landed up being 5 days, but I think it was really good because we moved from this understanding of right now we're outside of the triangle. We're sitting in an undesirable sort of space where we think of human values for nature. It's unsustainable. But we also recognize that we have diverse values for nature. We need nature from an instrumental perspective, where we're getting food and fiber, etc. That's what we've called nature society, right? Sort of getting those direct instrumental benefits from nature. But we also recognize that nature has intrinsic value, right? What we've called nature for nature, that it has a right to exist in and of itself, coming back to the, well, what we call interspecies justice in the Earth Commission, but I think it was biodiversity justice that Rashid referred to yesterday. And then there's this other messier corner of the triangle, which is where we look at relational values for nature, what we call nature as culture, which is trying to break down a barrier of nature and society being divided, right? Where there are many worldviews and perspectives that can't even conceptualize this part of the triangle because it is so fundamentally embedded in a worldview or experience that we are one. It's part of our identity, right? That we are connected with nature. And it became an imperfect way of actually describing it, because when we took it to plenary, we had to recognize that actually there's this messy intersection, right? That actually in reality, all of these things combined, we hold multiple values in multiple ways in multiple places. But from a modeling perspective in particular, it was important to draw out that there are different ways of valuing and that we need to recognize this relational perspective like fundamentally, because if we don't do that, we'll end up just emphasizing the instrumental values, right, which are easy to model, which we can talk about agricultural yields, right? We can talk about fisheries catch or maximum sustainable yield, right? Those are very much instrumental values. They're easy to measure. Well, maybe not that easy to measure, but we have them as indicators. But some of the others are a lot harder, but they're still important. So we need to put them there. We need to be explicit about these values, and that you can get co-benefits, but that there are trade-offs, right, between these. An intrinsic value, letting nature be nature for itself, could mean not getting from it, right, not actually getting the instrumental values from nature, but just leaving it be, right? So there are definite trade-offs that, again, we need to start to make explicit. So there are many uses that we've put into the Nature Futures Framework visioning, and that's largely what I've been doing, and the examples that I'll be giving a little bit later. Also about pathways. This is work that we're playing around with at the moment, because it's, the first step is to sort of imagine what that transformative future looks like, close our eyes, okay, yes, that's where we want to be. How do we then get there, right? And it's what I keep on coming back to is the reality check when we do the participatory processes. So we're working through this in the Earth Commission. There's also a transformation pathways work stream that we're working on, trying to actually think through, okay, once we've imagined these futures, what are the steps that we need to take? What are some of the key bifurcation points, like where you can't actually have both of these? You can't set aside a half Earth, right, where you kick people off half of the Earth and leave it to nature, and also have expansive agriculture, right? You probably have to concentrate in cities. There's some decisions, especially at the global level, that from a modeling perspective you have to make. And it's never going to be the future that we land up in, but they're important exercises to make decisions explicit, to force us to imagine what some of these pathways could be, what those endpoints are that we actually aspire towards, and what those hard decisions are going to be along the way. We've also developed narratives. We've done both qualitative modeling, also increasingly some quantitative modeling. I'll give an example of that. And an ongoing process of developing better indicators for these pluralistic nature values, as I was coming back to. So we, at the global level, derived a set of what we called illustrative narratives, which define not just the corners of the triangle, but also the sides, because I find those quite interesting, where you actually have to combine two different value perspectives, is what we called them. And we kind of sliced them in various ways, and we focus, actually, this next slide is easier to say. We kind of did a half Earth, whole Earth as sort of a narrative of this is what some people are saying are going to be preferable futures. We need to give half the Earth to nature. And there are multiple other perspectives that are like, we're fundamentally connected to nature. We need a whole Earth approach, right? We can talk about a land sparing versus land sharing, right? Again, these aren't scientific fact that this is better than the other. They have different good and bad aspects to them. It starts to become a value choice rather than an evidence-based choice. And then we wanted to bring the economics. So here, Rashid, this was your chance to wake up is we had a post-growth versus a green growth economic paradigm, right? Again, not saying that these are good or bad, but there's a continuum across this that we need to take into account from a decision-making perspective. And then we put a whole bunch of these all together and have some narratives developed around that. And we've started to also put numbers to it, some quantitative modeling, and there's a whole group trying to get together for BESIM 2 that Enrique Pereira's trying to lead on to actually see how we could quantitatively model this. But they have done it for Europe. So Peter Verberg's postdoc, I think it was, published this using land use change scenarios for Europe. So this exists. There are a few others. Increasingly, I think also the Netherlands has been doing some work around quantifying this. So it is possible to get nice land use change models, quantitative aspects out of this. It's not just a warm, fuzzy storytelling aspect, but that is what I'm going to focus on. Because there's also, I think, a need to tell better science stories. And this was actually an editorial in Nature. It was back in 2018 in response to my friend and colleague's PhD thesis, Andrew Merry, who did some science fiction prototyping on radical ocean futures. Yeah, and there was this recognition that, we talk about science policy interface, how do we get evidence into sort of decision making, but largely this imagination gap or this discourse or the stories that we tell ourselves going back to those extrapolations, don't look up narratives that we're told. We're getting climate change stories, we're getting biodiversity stories in our media, but they're not necessarily telling us how we get out of this crisis. They're generally post-apocalyptic, right? Like we have the collapse and then some sort of Mad Max future arises or something else, right? And so in order to tell better science stories, what do we need? And I sort of posit that we've got 3 ingredients that we need to be focusing on. And the first is building imagination, building imaginative capacity. And again, the theme of science fiction, fantasy authors, Ben Okri's quote here about knowledge is empty without imagination, that no civilization ever became great on knowledge alone. That there's this other really important aspect of that imagination helps us to transcend conventional thinking and helps us make meaning from experience, and in particular from instances where stable and particular stable facts and data mix in with shifting emotions, memories, intention, right? That there's data, but that we're all humans. We all have memories. We all have feelings, emotions, and that there's a messy space that we need to be grappling with that. And then, in particular, at this point, and I feel like I've been saying this for a while now, and it just keeps on coming back. In fact, the last time I said it was 8 years ago. We can remember what happened then. So Beck in 1992 sort of talks about people being unable or unwilling to incorporate novelty into the way they think about the future, or to find a place for the emergence or the rich potential of the unknowable. Then for them, the lived experience of change becomes disorienting and they become defensive, right? And that's when you see these narratives of great again, right? Of sort of going back, of harking to a past that never was, right? But there's a nostalgic reaction because change is just terrifying, right? We don't have the capacities to deal with the immigrants coming to take our jobs or these other really scary stories that get perpetuated, right? And so you get this nostalgic reaction. And it has been posited that, imaginative capacity, that ability to anticipate, to live with uncertainty and with the unpredictable, because the world is complex and we're never going to be able to predict it, is a really important capacity that's probably underplayed quite a bit as you've seen this rise of populism across the world. So that's the first ingredient. The second is a need for diverse knowledge systems. And so we keep on going back to this. I think we were all convinced in this room, but it still needs to be said, that knowledge co-production is really important, that there are multiple ways of seeing the world that need to be recognized, but not necessarily integrated, right? And I really like this quote by Dodi Chakraborty, who says, we can't be sacrificing equity on the altar of integration, right? The whole point of this, of the multiple evidence base, there are multiple relevant, important knowledge systems, but they don't become one at the end, because we have historical power biases, right, and how we see the world. We can't have everything captured by notions of Western science, but it also has a really important role that it needs to play. But so do other kinds of experiences. And how does this rich picture actually help us weave these knowledge systems together so we actually have a better understanding of what it is we want? And things that we can't explain. And I'll come into some of that as we go forward. And then here's another process, and Juliana was part of this. We also need the third ingredient, creative participatory process, right? We actually bring people together, we get them to build these capacities to actually imagine, to co-create, to think of what could it look like in the future, how would we get there, and bounce ideas off each other, because it's only by being in a collective and actually co-producing that we're actually going to be able to get a rich sense of what these diverse possibilities could be. So those are the three ingredients, and now into some of the examples that we've been working on. This quote, and it's because so much of my work comes from the African continent, because it's home. Ivor Hartman pulled together the first anthology on science fiction in 2012, and he said that this quote that also draws from something that Nnedi Okorafor, a Nigerian-American author, said, is that science fiction is the only genre that enables African writers to envision a future from an African perspective. And the value of this envisioning can't be negated, because if you can't see and relay an understandable vision of the future, your future will be co-opted by someone else's vision, one that doesn't necessarily have your best interest at heart, right? And I think the development paradigm that has been forced into most global South developing First Nations peoples falls largely into that. This is what you need. This is what development looks like. This is the future that you need to be going towards, which completely discounts any lived experience or reality or capacity of people to actually envision and imagine their own futures. And again, that's why this participatory process, actually working with people on the ground, is so important, because that's where the knowledge actually lies. And so I mentioned it in one of our talks earlier. One of the first processes that we did with my African Futures project at Sweden, with now a PhD student, a master's student at the time, that was working with Gary and myself, was on nature futures visioning with the Ngoni Kingdom in Malawi, and we had artists that sort of captured some of those discussions, but also a speculative fiction anthology called Mambera Rising, which I urge all of you to go and download for free from our website. And actually, the second story, Hiraeth, was recently longlisted for the British Fiction Association's short stories category. So we're also getting recognized within literature, which is quite fun. And it was just a different way of engaging with narratives, writing stories about what these potential futures could be. And we had the Nkosi Yamakosi, the Chief of Chiefs, sort of come through to the launch. It was on a lot of book club lists in Malawi at some point, which was also really interesting to us. So it was getting exactly to that discourse, to people just out there who want a good story, to be able to engage with the kind of work that we were doing, which was quite special. I showed you that image earlier on the work we were doing for the high seas. And we landed up also, again, not having to use language or graphs. There were a lot of graphs in Rashid's talk yesterday, which were really good at explaining relationships. I use art instead and sort of work with artists on this. But this is now the participatory part of the talk. If we so each of these was used to describe one of the corners of the Nature Futures framework. So if I said which was and Giuliano, you're not allowed to respond, obviously. You should know, you should pass the test. If we looked at the top image, which corner of the triangle do you think that's sort of representing? Just shout. Nature for nature, yeah, exactly. And then the bottom left-hand corner? These two are harder. Yell. Nature, culture, yeah. And then nature for society, other end. So again, you don't need language. You don't need to put it in English or in, Spanish or you can have an image and you can engage with it and be like, oh, I like this aspect of, oh, that's a bit uncomfortable, right? Because transformative futures should also be comfortable. So yes, that's correct. We also last year went through a envisioning process for desirable coral reefs, or desirable futures for coral reefs, which is really hard to do because they're such vulnerable ecosystems at the moment. Actually thinking of them being able to have a desirable future was quite hard, but we did. We have, and this was Joaquim and my postdoc, Ignacio, who did this amazing analysis and is writing up the paper from this now, and hopefully it can make it into the synthesis at some point, because she has something on coral reefs, which was the system that we were missing. So there were also stories, and now we just ran a bunch of online workshops to try and get better pathways. And it's interesting, you're starting to see the need for collapse at some point, some of the stories before you get somewhere else. You start to actually having to make clear sort of decisions from an economic perspective. For instance, if you are able to end full subsidies, where do you reallocate that money to, right? That takes you down different kinds of pathways. And we were also joined by a very special person over here, and this was just to make sure he was awake. So he was very happy about the desirable coral reef futures. So it's a great photo. Come on, Rashid. And here's some more people in the room, some other photos from there. So mine and Andrea's PhD students in Napon just ran an amazing case study in Benin and Togo on the monotrans boundary reserve corridor. And he brought together a variety of different stakeholders, from government through to indigenous knowledge holders. And we had a bunch of plays around the futures that we were trying to get to, and also started to unpack some of the pathways to get. So again, drawing on diverse knowledge systems, focusing on mangroves in this instance, which will hopefully also be feeding into the West Africa case study for Solving-FCB. But this is another sort of key example of how we started from the framework, but actually just got into very different spaces in terms of preferable, what do people actually want, and what are some of the steps, and in particular drawing on some really interesting local knowledge and belief systems, because, and I didn't know this, that Vodun is actually the official religion in Benin, which means that it's just formally recognized, kind of these practices that are actually still held firmly within so many communities. And these are great leverage points, right, for being able to actually go back to realizing a cultural, historical connection to place, to each other, to nature, that we can take into the future. And the important point, that I wanted to make in the Malawi case, and I'd said it in some of our discussions earlier, was what was really fascinating about the two workshops we ran, which each had, we asked each of the chiefs to come and to bring a female representative and a youth representative with them in order to have as diverse a group of participants as possible. And the general consensus, particularly in the first workshop, was an inability to imagine a preferable future without actually connecting to a pre-colonial past. That you could not actually imagine something in a colonial setting, right, as being preferable. But you could go back to a pre-colonial moment and actually sort of build our futures from there. And it wasn't about that we're going to go back into the past, right? But it was about recognizing what we actually value and desire and aspire towards was embedded in that past, and we need to go back and retain that in order to take it into the future. And so that leaves me with my final image, which is generally incomprehensible and confusing unless I explain it. But it was a piece that I did with some of my research associates. We called it the entangled time tree, and it was building off the futures cone, which looks at projected futures and probable futures and possible futures, and the fact that actually the most likely are the preposterous If you actually look historically at the kinds of transformations that we've had, we're like, okay, this is thinking of future in a very Western linear notion of we're starting now and we're kind of seeing the future happen in front of us. But we all recognize that many cultures around the world do not see time in a linear way, right? So how do you do scenario planning when people don't think of the future as there, when the future is behind, the future is circular, or the future is just a very different way of like actually engaging? This was our first step into no way solving the problem, but it was trying to conceptualize the fact that, first of all, we need to recognize that there are multiple pasts, right, that we all come from and that we experience, and that they're known pasts. They're also myths, and they're forgotten histories, and they're erased pasts. And that also comes to this idea of going back to a pre-colonial moment. What have we lost, right? What has been erased from these experiences that people have had that we need to try and think through? And that leads us into all experiencing and inhabiting multiple presents, right? Which is kind of hard for us to conceptualize. But Roberto Poli, in Anticipation, the discipline of anticipation, talks about a thick present, right? That it's not just this moment in time, but that it's actually quite thick. And I think that talks to the idea that because of our different pasts and our different perspectives, sort of coming from South Africa as a white South African, I have a very different history to my good friend and colleague Oderilwe, right, who is a black male South African, right? And we're both South African, we're both in the same time. But the different histories or experiences that we have mean that we embody different presents. Doesn't mean to say that we can't understand and appreciate those, but we need to recognize that. And that then means that there are different futures that can unfold. And so this sort of the blue line follows a more sort of Western notion of linear time. We can project, right, and we can open up preposterous futures using a futures cone perspective, and that each of us has a different way of thinking through that. So there are multiplicities embedded within that too. And there are also other ways of seeing the future. So Sankofa, right, a drawing from our Ghanaian colleagues, Sankofa bird, which is about moving forward, always looking backwards with the seeds of the past, right, in its mouth, to be like, you have to be connected to ancestors. You have to have that connection to the past in order to be able to go forward, right? And then there's this other component, the yellow, which is just loopy and going back and is like just constantly circular, right? And that we're constantly going through different forms of understanding time. And that's in many other indigenous knowledge systems, the way that the time can be conceptualized. And this doesn't in any way capture all of them, but at least it's starting to diversify our ways of thinking about future, being able to capture and acknowledge the fact that we don't all have the same pasts, we don't all inhabit the same presence, and we don't all think about the future in the same way. And that should not be a scary thought. It should be exciting, because it probably helps us with the original mission that we started with, was actually imagining what these preferable futures are that we're trying to transformatively change towards. What is that orientation? Because we know we need transformation, but where are we transforming to? And it's kind of terrifying that The Economist already in 2011 said that humans have changed the way the world works, but now we have to change the way that we think about it too. So thank you so much.
Laura, thanks very much for a very inspiring talk. Let's have some questions. There is time. And I will probably prioritize the young researchers in the room, if there are questions.
I'm the youngest one. Somebody called me a student yesterday.
There is some bias, but
At least I'm younger than Rashid, so. Yeah, so the future you envision, you desire, depends so much on a lot of factors, including constraints, things that limit. It could even be information, how much you know, how much you are aware of. It could also be based on uncertainties, because things do happen. How are all these factored into that future that people or communities will envision, and how do they come into some compromise, especially if you have different people with different experiences, different risk profiles and all that. When they are envisioning that future, how does this individual peculiarities play into that future and the pathways towards the path that lead to those futures? Thank you.
So thanks for that wisdom. I mean, it's really important because we are constrained, and I think that's why one of those important ingredients was the process. So we do need to bring people together to actually go through this process, because we can't imagine for someone else. We can only imagine for ourselves. And it's quite interesting because you don't necessarily have to compromise. It's not about reaching consensus. It's about going through the process of building imagination. I think actually everyone has that ability to imagine. You don't need knowledge or education or anything. Everyone can be like, no, this is what I want for myself. And it's amazing. Most people are actually able to do it with the different tools and methods that we have. And on pathways, what we started to do is to just recognize the fact that we don't have consensus and we might want to do different things. And then you put both things down and you're like, at least we're making it explicit that someone wants to go down this path and someone else wants to go down that path. And that's okay, because right now we're thinking that we all want to achieve, that when we achieve the SDGs, we all think of it as the same thing in different countries. And it's like, well, no, it's a global goal, but how to, I think that's why we haven't achieved it. How to get there is really contested, right? And we haven't just acknowledged that fact, that actually some of those pathways are going to be very different, and they're going to be different winners and losers depending on which choices we make. And so the process, it's not solving the problem, right? But it's an important step towards recognizing where some of those barriers might actually be and how we could then move beyond that and hold this plurality in the messy complexity that it is, because it is uncertain. We're never going to predict the future, but we do know we need to transform, right? And so this is trying to hold that that human ability to hold like a cognitive dissonance, right, in terms of the kinds of decisions we need to make, and just to make that explicit and maybe a little bit more comfortable in our decision-making processes. But it is really difficult, particularly from a government perspective, for example. You know, policy is not good at recognizing time is not linear, for example. But I think it's still an important endeavor to go about doing.
Yeah, can I go? Oh. Yeah, so Laura, you know, Laura took us to another. What happened? Why are you laughing, William?
Nicole is trying to gesticulate madly.
Okay, so let me cut myself off. That's also good. But you will regret that you haven't heard from me, okay?
So, first a comment and also a question behind it. So I just wanted to say that for me it was so impactful and inspiring. This, it's not a graph, but this representation that you showed of the past, the present, and the future, and how different we can all perceive just time overall. And I just see, like, especially thinking right now about everything that's happening around the world, just the power of coming together, understanding each other, listening to each other, to just really be able to actually work together. So I just wanted to say that's extremely inspirational and very powerful. And my question to you is, I think that even if something, you know, if for us that is maybe new or very inspirational and impactful, how can we make sure that everyone, other people, students, young people, people who are not in science, can try to see this value? Because I think right now it's very, very crucial for people to come together, and in a world that it's becoming even more divisive all the time. Thank you.
So thanks for that. So 2 responses and the reflections, because obviously I cannot, if I had the answer, I would have shared it a long time ago and we would have been doing it. But I do think there are some interventions. And I think actually it's less about, I think your non-scientifically trained person actually has much better abilities to do this than a lot of science. And I was putting it into our coral reefs chat at some point on Monday after we had an Earth Commission meeting, and I was like, is there just a pill that I can give, particularly like scientists or academics, researchers in particular? We're really bad at this. Is there just a pill that I can give them where they'll understand the importance of all of this and we can just move forward rather than sounding like a endless record? So I actually think most people do innately have that capacity, but a lot of what we've been taught and how we think about the world constrains our ability to actually imagine. And so this is where the engagement with the humanities, with writers, with artists, with theater, we always land up with a little mini theater performance of the future, because it's a lot easier to understand where people are coming from than a set of sticky notes on a board. And obviously we also have the sticky notes, and we analyze the sticky notes because we need to write papers. But this engagement with speculative fiction, with art, and the reason I put up the movies, the series that are out there now, because I think that is getting into discourse, right? It is able to change our perceptions of what we value, of how we can potentially come together. And when you have an enemy to fight against, as we're increasingly starting to see, I think that is also where you start to see people come together. But at some point, I'll have to default to Andrea, my psychologist postdoc, who has much better insights as to this than I do. But that's why we started with these multiple tools, because just doing the scientific analysis in the papers is important, because the scientific community also needs to engage with this, and we need to be able to take it into assessment processes, right? So I think that was the big thing with the NFF, is we can explicitly put it there as an intergovernmental body and be like, engage with this, please. But we also need to do the other work.
Me, I think. Thanks. It was very inspiring and something that I wasn't aware of that was being done in so many places. My question is, like, which one of the steps is the hardest or the most challenging for you that have been like in these processes? And how much time have the processes like lasted? And at the end, like, where have you gone at the end the most farther of these steps? Thanks.
Cool. So some of those are terrifying questions, some of them are fun. So how far have we gone? So there was one, it's actually, so some of these are so poignantly terrifying. So there are two examples. There was one that we did from the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes project in Southern Africa, which took place in 2016. And there was one scenario which was post-Exodus. And it was literally the only way that they could conceptualize a preferable future was if all the billionaires moved to Mars and like left the rest of us to just get on with rebuilding things. And then you see Elon's fantastic plans for this. You're just like, oh my God, like how prescient was this in 2016? So that was one. And there was another one, and we turned it into a game called Survive the Century.net, so you can also just go on, and that was a geoengineering scenario pathway, which also had philanthropic billionaires solving the pandemic problem or not, and the other thing is that, and there is always the scientific reality, and I think this is also where some of the difficulty comes in, because we can imagine, we have a lot of capacities to imagine different futures. But we have the reality of climate change is locked in for a while. We can't just turn the switch off into this utopian future. So this is not about a utopian imagining. And in that, in those pathways, without actually doing any form of climate engineering, whether it was sort of, it wasn't solar geoengineering only. We also had sort of tree planting, etc. If you didn't take any of those routes and you still did all of the best things, you still had to rely on a volcano in the 2080s to actually bring the temperature back down to, I think it was 1 degree above pre-industrial levels by 2100. right? So, you know, just thinking through, there's that biophysical reality that we face that is where the modeling is really important, where we do still need the numbers and we do need to look at these relationships, and some of these things are going to be impossible, but we need to do the imagining to feed into them, because I think right now the constraint is we start with what we can put numbers to and we project those. And that's, I think, where some of the lack of imagination in terms of the interventions that we could use comes in. And I think that's where the challenge actually lies in terms of doing this and getting that messy intersection right between the importance of the science and reality checks, but also our ability to imagine transformations, right? And that sometimes these don't have to be plausible, right? But they're still important to sort of unlock imagination. So that would be, I think, one of the biggest challenges, and the other is the participatory process, because it takes time and it's not easy. And as I said, I'd love to give everyone a pill, but obviously that's not going to work, right? And it takes a lot of resources, right, to bring people together. And, you know, they've got day jobs that they're supposed to be doing. Why are they coming into your workshop to imagine things, right? And quite often they do leave quite excited about being able to go forward. But any participatory process is going to have that constraint of time and resources, and we're not going to be able to do it for the whole planet. So you are always going to have to make choices. Who's in the room, right? What are you including? Therefore, what are you by default excluding in that? And this is just complicates things, but I think it shouldn't never inhibit us from actually doing more of this work.
It's me.
Yes, no, I see
Yeah.
this hand, but I'm relying on Christian.
But I have the microphone. Can you go back to the last slide, to the other one, the previous one? Yes. So I can completely understand that there are multiple pasts, and based on that also multiple presents, and based on that also multiple futures. Since you have so much experience with these workshops and with all these methods you're using, I'm wondering, did you find in the multiple futures common elements, values which are shared among these different futures, and how can you or can we use these common elements in order to get a step further closer to the desirable futures?
So I think we're getting to a point where we've done enough of this work where we are starting to see some of those commonalities. And it's quite interesting because those vision endpoints that we see tend to be more common. It's the pathways and the what you need to do to get there when it comes back to the present and the degree of difference where you start to see a lot more conflict arising. Because I think we can all agree, we don't want inequality. We want nature to be flourishing. We want healthy food systems, right? And that will be your big business all the way down to sort of your smallholder farmer. So those endpoints are fine. What we need to change to get there, I think, is what starts to become the really controversial aspect. But we're starting to see, and we've done this with the Earth Commission, that there are different ways of dividing this. Again, those bifurcation points of, is it a global governance? Is it highly decentralized? Like, there's no necessarily right or wrong way of doing that, but you have very different types of worlds, right, if you're looking at it that way, similar from an economics perspective or et cetera. So there are some very differentiating factors there.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. So I was just thinking about this nature framework. So is it any part of the world that it is being practiced? And what are some of the indicators that you can use to track progress with nature to nature? And how is trade-off being managed, possible trade-off? So that's my question.
And so all of the examples I gave were using the Nature Futures framework. So Malawi, Benin, we're doing an African regional one. We've done it in, and it's not just me, a lot of European case studies are happening. Coral reefs, we've got there. So it's been done in many different places. And we also, it's not my expertise, Haejin Kim, we've been doing it in Korea actually, and she's got a really interesting project at the moment, which is trying to work with modelers to also find what some of those indicators and metrics could be across different things. We are focusing on the demilitarized zone, which is another really interesting part because it's thriving for nature, right? But because it's a demilitarized zone, there aren't any people there, right? And so I don't think we're at a point of tracking that yet. I think we're still at a point of developing those indicators. And the whole point and the whole idea is about messy plurality, right? That it isn't we want to go from here to here and we just need to measure that. It's about there are many different theirs that we could go to track along there. But there are tons of examples, and we've got a whole website that Gary's put up now that you can go and find out more.
Laura? Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. We are really learning a lot about that. Actually, we are using some of these methodologies for the Costa Rica case study. And you mentioned something very important about participatory processes and the challenges around this that are time consuming and that also require funding, long-term funding. I was wondering, what do you think could be fundamental changes in designing research, for example, transdisciplinary processes, or in funding also in order to follow this kind of long-term processes?
I mean, I think this falls into the challenges of transdisciplinarity that we're facing and the fact that we still need papers, but that communities don't care about papers. And we do still actually, and it's interesting, quite a lot of people do want to write and actually have their names on the papers, which I think is encouraging. But for those for whom it makes sense, right? Again, what we did for Ngoni, we commissioned artists, so the art actually went back to the community. They've got the storybooks that they're sharing amongst themselves. We're looking increasingly at multiple translations into local languages, so it's not just an English dominant. So all of those things I think can help encourage people that they can also, even if not in the room, but we can go back with products that they can discuss and within themselves without us being there as kind of facilitators and let the process sort of grow from there. But yeah, so funding transdisciplinary things, the outputs that were expected, the kind of reporting, all of that is not just in the scenarios in future space. But I also think we can be more creative in terms of what we do, like the online game Survive the Century, which can be, if you've got an internet connection, can be played anywhere, right? I do it with students all the time. Can just start to seed some of that thinking, right? And we're hopefully going to do this with this Ocean Visions Futures project that we have, where we can be a bit more participatory, so you don't have to be in the room, but you can use these different kinds of devices to be able to construct your own future, like choose your own adventure stories kind of ideas, and play with that. But it's also, again, something that we're going to have to work on improving.
Thanks, Laura. I'd like to encourage another question in the room.
William, I think.
William?
Rashid. I think we got to give it to
And then the mic goes back to Rashid, yes.
The mic drop. I love you, Rashid.
Thank you, Laura. As usual, it's a great talk and really inspiring. And I think it relates to some of the discussion earlier on. I think and you mentioned that in your talk and answer as well, that a lot of the time the mass majority of people, not people in the room, but like mass majority of the populations, I mean, their imagination now in more than ever is driven by what they heard. I mean, with all the social media, AI, and things like that, even more than ever, that they they are guided to think what other people's much more powerful people's want them to think about, want them to imagine, and so this process is great. As you said, that is really costly. Is often is quite limited in the amount of people that you can include. So how can you counter that? Because ultimately, the government will do things that are based on the support of the mass majority. While people in this room, although we can say what we want, but ultimately they would still depends on the people. So how do we counter that? Is there a push that you can build that gaps that Yeah, I know this is a big question, but I think there's something maybe we can want to hear your thought on this.
Yeah, so again, don't have the silver bullet solution, but I think two things. The first is we still need to recognize the power of science, actually. So I know that we get really concerned about the lack of faith in science, sort of, post-truth, whatever kind of moment. But you look at these intergovernmental processes, and there are so many governments around the world. So forget the US and some of the governments in the EU, but you look at the African continent, and they just like, give us information, help us. We want to help our people and our nature to do better. And yes, there are a lot of other interests that are capturing those, but I think there is still a lot of political will. And we've relied on particular, and Rashid, you can also talk to this, right? Economic models, development models, right, that have been sort of forced on people that trickle-down economics will work, or that will be able to, like, liberal trade will be able to get you all of these things, or the silver handcuffs. And I think science being able to counter that by recognizing and legitimizing these kinds of processes and aspirations is a really important counter to that. Right, to be like, well, actually, no, we've done some of this modeling. There is also evidence, and it's about appreciating multiple cases, right? And the importance of imagination and storytelling, as well as putting the numbers to it. So that's a powerful step in and of itself. And I think we've also got indicators, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I was mentioning, you saw Black Lives Matter, you saw Me Too, you've seen within even within Hollywood, Western media, a fundamental shift in what you're actually seeing on your screen these days compared to 20 years ago. So I think the arts, right, humanities and musicians and that we are aspiring to are also pushing back, right, and saying, no, this is not what we want. And you just see the rise in African and speculative fiction writers that are being internationally now and winning awards, and stories that were never told before, but you can have Shigiri, so Wole Talabi, who can't make it to our workshop this month, but was supposed to be there, who won a Locus Award, I think, talking about trying to get the Benin bronze back. They were gods in the pantheon. Those kinds of stories that you would never have had access to before are drawing on. I think that is also hope for reconfiguring our imagination. So I think there is a pushback, whether it's probably not, but I do see that that's a narrative that we can try and even with from China and Japan, Korea, you're starting to see a lot of these narratives also starting to shift and change our perception. So we have to have hope, otherwise I'm not sure whether we'd be doing this.
So you really are helping a lot of people. She goes all over the world. You see her in a taxi somewhere, next minute she's there. So you give us hope. But my question is that you talk about all this, we all have our dreams, our history and so on, which is through each individual, right? The challenge I see is, in general, you can have your dream. Sometimes you are not allowed to actually realize your dream. And your example from which country did you say? They wanted to go back to pre-colonial days, right? And our First Nations lady who couldn't make it, she said something in UBC. She said, our development path was simply stolen from us. It was stolen from us. And I feel the same with Africa, right? We were doing our thing as whatever it was. We're working our way, and then bang, this is too primitive, get out, we grab you. And this is still happening. It is even the case that even Canada does not have its right to decide its destiny. That's what we're seeing. We're going to annex you, right? And so this is scary, right? I mean, and I love to dream, otherwise we won't be here. But there's also the reality. And Trudeau just said a week or so, the president is serious about this. I think he's still in Europe trying to get some support because he really sees the pressure. So you can dream, but your dream is useless. Their dream is the dream. How do you deal with that, my dear sister? Give us.
I have a dream, no. And I think that we could just accept those narratives and the dominance and the business agenda's trajectory. But I don't think that's what humans do. I think we've always fought back, right? And I come from a country with a history of exactly that, right? And South Africa, in its post-apartheid, and I was mentioning this earlier, right? When there was an apartheid government to fight against, you could see the rallying together of the ANC. And it's crumbling post that. But also it's, our maturity as a democratic country, right, in a government of national unity, which terrifies the West. They're like, oh my God, like the ANC is out. And I was like, but isn't this exactly what you told us to do, right? To like now have multiple parties going for it. But it is about the fact that transformations can actually happen, right? And you can see those fundamental reconfigurations happening. And they can be for the good, like a post-apartheid South Africa, and they can be for the bad, like a colonization, right, or a neo-colonization, right, or a neo-capturing of the Gulf of America, whatever, Lord. So I think the whole point is that what we're trying to do is not going to save the planet. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but I think it's an important step in, we need to say those things. We need to say that we cannot imagine a preferable future without acknowledging that it was stolen or that we have been colonized, and that we need to go back and recognize that what was decimated and erased is actually valuable, and we can bring that forward. And I think we're seeing that coming out in popular culture now, right? And it's not everyone, and it's not everywhere, and it's not all at once. But I think it is starting to happen, and the flip is that it should be everyone, everywhere, all at once doing this, right? For this, exactly. And so I think it's important, again, to make explicit, to state these things, and to state these things with the power that we do have in the room as eminent researchers with governments and with corporations and with those powerful people actually listening to us sometimes, or the foundations that, I was thinking the Bezos Earth Fund, right, is a really fascinating example of, billionaire philanthropic, but also wanting to do good, and there's so many things you can unpack there, but they do listen to us. So if we say this and we make it legitimate and we publish the papers and we do the assessments and we feed into that discourse, I do think things could change, right? But we need to be explicit, we need to acknowledge it as a first starting point, right? And from there we can start to take things up, and we can open up the space for these important conversations, right, that recognize difference, but that actually there is a transformative path that we need to go down. So yeah, they're there, and we can't ignore them, but we can fight back against them. I think is the take-home message. Because without hope, what are we? Yeah.
So I think we're good for coffee break. And then we are probably upstairs and divide into 4 groups for the modeling workshop. Or what's